America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on the country of Colombia, a strong security partner of the U.S. and bulwark of democracy in South America. Our guest, Juan Manuel Santos, served as the President of Colombia from 2010 to 2018. Prior to his presidential term, Santos held positions as Colombia's Minister of Foreign Trade, Minister of Finance and Public Credit, and Minister of National Defense. In 2016, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his successful efforts in negotiating a peace treaty with the FARC guerrillas, ending a 5-decade-long civil war that left 220,000 Colombians dead. For thousands of years, indigenous societies settled and thrived in pre-Colombia. Alonso de Ojeda, a companion of Christopher Columbus, integrated Colombia into the Spanish Empire as a colony. Colombia remained one of many Spanish viceroyalties in the region until it gained independence in 1819 after a 9-year battle led by Simón Bolívar. In the early 20th century, Colombia faced internal divisions, as well as tensions with neighboring countries with shared histories as Spanish viceroyalties, such as Ecuador and Panama. In 1948, after Colombian politician and liberal presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitán was assassinated during the International Conference of American States meeting in Bogotá, a decade of sporadic violence and unrest followed until the creation of the National Front government in 1958. The National Front government sought to conciliate inter-party rivalries. The liberal and conservative parties alternated holding the presidency and split cabinet representation. The custom of presidents, including opposition party members in the cabinet posts, continued 16 years past the National Front's termination. While some attribute the National Front arrangement to the sharp decline in violence, others argue it contributed to the rise of guerrilla groups like Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, known as the FARC, and the National Liberation Army, known as ELN, because the government did not allow space for dissent. Drug trafficking and violence increased with the rise of guerrilla groups in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Formed in 1964, the FARC employed terrorism and guerrilla tactics to promote Marxist-Leninist style agrarianism. The FARC was also an organized crime organization that grew and trafficked narcotics to finance its activities. By the early 2000s, Colombia exported 90% of the world's cocaine, and the FARC was responsible for 60% of Colombian cocaine in the United States. The situation in Colombia was desperate when, in 1999, the American and Colombian governments adopted Plan Colombia, an integrated foreign assistance, military, law enforcement, and diplomatic initiative aimed at combating Colombian drug cartels and left-wing insurgent groups, as well as strengthening state institutions and functions. In the early 2000s, both former presidents Andrés Pastrana and Álvaro Uribe pursued peace negotiations with the FARC to no avail. Upon election to a second term, President Uribe appointed then-leader of the Socialist Party of National Unity, Santos, as Minister of Defense. Minister Santos oversaw the strengthening of Colombia's military and directed increasingly effective and intensified operations against the FARC and militias, as insulated investigative and adjudicative bodies confronted the ruthless terrorist and organized crime networks. As president, Santos was determined to consolidate those gains and pursue a lasting peace. With the FARC's number 1, number 2, and 37 other commanders killed during his administration, the FARC was ready to negotiate in good faith for the first time. The efforts resulted in the 2016 peace deal that ended over 50 years of armed conflict. Challenges remain, however, and narcotics trafficking increased after the peace agreement. And following the election of President Ivan Duque in 2018, a former FARC leader called on dissidents to once again take up arms against government forces. We welcome President Santos as Colombia emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, copes with ongoing crisis in Venezuela, and prepares for a presidential election in 2022.
President Santos, welcome to Battlegrounds. Let me begin by saying what an honor it was to work with you when I was National Security Advisor, to continue to strengthen our relationship and the work that we're doing together, really to benefit the United States and Colombia, but really across the whole hemisphere. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you, General, for inviting me, and it's an honor to participate in this event.
Hey, I thought we might just begin the discussion with a general question. Could you tell our viewers about the tremendous success story of the last 2 decades in Colombia? Some of our viewers might not remember, that at the end of the last century, many were predicting that Colombia, enmeshed as it was in a terrible fight against an increasingly powerful drug cartels and insurgent organizations, Marxist insurgents. Some predicted, okay, Colombia is on an inexorable path towards state failure. How did you and other Colombian leaders and the Colombian people prove that prediction wrong?
Well, as you say, at the end of last century, the beginning of this century, we were on the verge of being declared a failed state. And this was because we were on the verge of being a failed state. 1/3 of our country was controlled by the guerrillas, another third by the paramilitaries, and the state was on the defensive. And across the board, we had the most powerful drug cartels in the world. So we were in deep trouble. And we decided that we had to correct the situation. And the relationship that we have always had, a very special relationship with the US, brought a plan, which was called the Plan Colombia. I remember very well, I was Minister of Finance at that time when President Clinton went to Colombia, to Cartagena. He went with the then chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Joe Biden. He went with the Speaker of the House, Speaker Hastert, because it was a bipartisan initiative, Plan Colombia, and they went to say to the Colombian government, you must make this work. We're investing a lot of our political capital, both the Republicans and the Democrats, and we need for you to also put all your heart, your will, and your passion behind this plan. And we said, yes, we will do that. And we designed a program to strengthen our armed forces, to strengthen the effectiveness of our armed forces. And we started also to strengthen the institutions that had to do with law and order, the justice system, the Attorney General's office, and the armed forces as institutions. We started to cooperate, and the United States gave us tremendous help in training our forces, training them better. And you gave us access to very important equipment, especially helicopters. We bought many of them. Some were given by the US, the state of the art in terms of helicopters, the Black Hawk helicopters. And Plan Colombia started to have very positive effects. Of course, that was one element. Plan Colombia was a key, was very helpful. But besides Plan Colombia, there was a political commitment of the Colombian political parties and the Colombian elite, if you want to call it in some way, to try to fix this situation, and through political will, through perseverance, through effectiveness of our armed forces, we started to bring the country back to what a normal democracy should be. We started to implement a new constitution that we had approved in the early 90s, a constitution that has as the core of its framework the defense of the human rights of the citizens. We started to infiltrate the drug cartels, to dismantle the drug cartels. We started to infiltrate and weakened the guerrilla forces. We had the FARC, which was the oldest and strongest guerrilla force in the whole of the Western Hemisphere. And so slowly, persevering, we dismantled the drug cartels, we demobilized the paramilitaries, and we were able to bring to the negotiating table the FARC guerrillas. We signed with them a peace process. They are now in the phase of implementing the peace process. And we also took very important economic and social decisions in order to strengthen our economy, to reduce the gap, because Colombia is a very unequal country between the rich and the poor, to strengthen the middle class, to strengthen our education system, to strengthen our health system. And that brought us to a point where in the year 2018, in the United Nations, we were declared the best news of the world by the UN Secretary General. I remember President Obama saying, "My God, what a tremendous step forward you've made to set a precedent for other countries through your own efforts." And I said our own efforts, but with the help of the US, we were able to bring Colombia to what we now have, which is a working democracy. We still have a lot of problems. We still have a lot of violence. We still have drug trafficking. But compared to what we were in the early century, or in the year 2000, which was when Plan Colombia was launched, it's a very, very big difference.
Well, I'll tell you, Mr. President, when I was briefing President Trump in advance of your visit to Washington in 2017, I used Colombia as an example of good news. And you recall at the time, we were in the midst of policy reviews on the Middle East and on South Asia, especially in connection with the Afghanistan war. And as I laid out sort of the history of the United States and Colombia working together, I tried to highlight, what can be done if we take a sustained long-term approach to complex problems, and if there is strong leadership in that country that has, as you mentioned, the political will, right, to be able to undertake the reforms and to strengthen the state and to combat these groups that had caused so much suffering in Colombia for so long. Could you explain to our viewers the nature of the US-Colombian relationship, the role that US assistance played over time, as maybe a way of sharing the good news and helping to maybe bolster our confidence in our ability to take an effective approach to foreign policy and to collective defense in this case?
Well, there is a special relationship between the US and Colombia that goes way back to probably when the OAS was created.
This is the Organization of American States.
Right. President Kennedy came to Colombia, and when he launched his program of the Peace Corps, Colombia was one of the countries where he was received with more enthusiasm. And since then, there's been a very good relationship with all the presidents. I personally had a relationship, a very positive relationship with President Reagan, Bush father, President Clinton, Bush Jr., with Obama, and with President Trump. As a matter of fact, with Obama and Trump, we had a special group that had the bilateral agenda that was chaired at a very high level. As a matter of fact, right now the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, was chairing that special group, and that allowed us to speak freely, bluntly, frankly. When we had trouble or problems, we addressed them directly, and that helped very, very much. And Colombia became the best ally of the US in Latin America. And that was even said publicly. Sometimes our neighbors in the region and our friends in the region felt a little jealous. Why are you such a good friends of the Americans? And he said, because we nourish this relationship, we feed this relationship almost on a daily basis, and has always been a bipartisan relationship. And we not only had a good relationship with the executive, we had very good friends in Congress, friends for a long time. So that created a special bond. And also the relationship with the armed forces, with the Navy, with the Army, our fight together against drug trafficking, and our fight together against the guerrillas, that also created a special bond. And because many Americans say that you came to Colombia to teach us many things, and that the students became better than the professors. Because, for example, General, you might remember that there are some sort of Olympic Games of the Special Forces in the Americas, Canada, US, Brazil, Argentina. And in the last years, I'm glad and proud to say, I'm sorry to say it in a US audience, but Colombia has been number one and the US has been number two. But that type of relationship has been extremely well. And we have a very good relationship in terms of trade. We have a free trade agreement with the US. We have a lot of cooperation in other sectors. We're now working almost in every aspect of our respective national agendas, the environment, education, and even now with this pandemic, we have had a very fluent communication and good cooperation. And I think this is an example of two countries that understand how diplomacy should work, how good relations should be nurtured every day, that are relations that are based on values, on principles that we share. We share with the US the basic values and principles of our political systems. And that has allowed us to work together bilaterally and to work together multilaterally. And I think, and we should continue to do that, because the benefits of that, we can see them every day, and we can multiply them if we continue with this attitude on both sides.
I think two of the points you made are so important. The candid discussions that we have with one another. There's no pretense ever in our conversations, and then those relationships that we've built over time. You know, when I was commander of Fort Benning, we had that special relationship with the Lanceros, between the Ranger School and the Lanceros, and one of the greatest old soldiers, Colonel Ralph Puckett, was one of the founders of the Lancero School. And of course, as you've mentioned, your special operations forces are just world class, and we come in second now in competitions within the hemisphere. And then some of the tremendous operations that your special operations forces conducted. You want to share with maybe our listeners would you mind sharing the story of the 2008 hostage rescue operation that was extraordinarily successful?
Well, yes, we had 15 kidnapped people by the FARC guerrillas, 3 of them Americans. They were in the middle of the Amazon jungle, and they were very well guarded, and we had no idea where they were. Of course, there was a tremendous pressure from the U.S. say, let's rescue our compatriots, and of course, from our side, we had also a tremendous pressure. And there was this very important lady. She had been a presidential candidate, and she had also a French citizenship. So there was a tremendous pressure from France and from the whole of Europe. Well, in one of the lessons, of many lessons that I learned from US intelligence and British intelligence, I learned that the intelligence should think out of the box, should be creative, should be audacious. And I told that to the people of my intelligence when I was Minister of Defense. Think out of the box, out of the ordinary. If you have very strange and crazy ideas, bring them up. We will analyze them. And there was 2 ladies who were hearing the conversations of the FARC leaders for many years, and they knew exactly how they communicated through their radio operators. They even imitated their voices, and they said, "I think if we can get into their communications, we can supplant the radio operators and give them orders." And at the very low level, they said, "No, you're crazy. This is impossible." But somebody brought me the idea, and I said, it sounds crazy, but it's possible. And I started to push the commander of the army and the commanders of the intelligence in all the forces. Let's see if this could work. And we got intercepted one of the communications, and we tried, and one of these ladies supplanted the radio operator of one of the commanders, and she said, "Do this and do that," and they did it. So we said, wow, we have here the possibility of rescuing the kidnapped people. And so we penetrated the communications of the people who were guarding the kidnapped persons, and we gave them the order to release them and give them to a humanitarian mission, because the new commander of the FARC, because the old one had died, wanted to see them. And that helicopter and that humanitarian mission was the Colombian Army Intelligence. And we were giving the 15 kidnapped people, that was full of guerrillas, about 300. They went out of the camp where they were in the middle of the jungle. And so without spilling one drop of blood, we rescued from the fiercest and strongest guerrilla forces 15 kidnapped people. I remember that Larry King, that he died some weeks ago, interviewed me that day, and he said, Minister Santos, I am my hobby is intelligence, military intelligence operations. And I must say, this has been the most astonishing operation I have seen. And then when I went to Washington, President Bush was so excited. He said, when Minister Santos comes, don't bring him to the Oval Office. I will go to where he is, and I will go to him. And I was precisely in the office of the National Security Advisor, and he came and he said, "Congratulations, and I know who can be you in the film of this operation." And I said, "Who is that, Mr. President?" And I make a parenthesis. I was with my ambassador, Carolina Barco, ambassador at that time. She had been in my same class, so she has my same age. When President Bush said, "Harrison Ford," she said, "No, I object." And I said, "Why? He's too old." That was a tremendous operation, and it's something that we were very proud of. And the three Americans were rescued, and they are now living with their families without one drop of blood being spilled.
It's an example of the strength of Colombian institutions and the military over time. An example of your strong leadership in a crisis. And later as president, you received the Nobel Prize, right, for the tremendous achievement of a peace agreement with the FARC. But as you know, it's not been an easy road, as you know better than anybody, in terms of implementing the agreement and consolidating the gains that were made over 2 decades. And when we met in the White House, we had discussions about concerns over the peace agreement, especially the increase in narcotics trafficking. So I was just going to ask you, how do you see the situation now? What more could Colombia, with support of the United States, do to address production distribution of coca? What other obstacles do you see from a security perspective today? I'll just note for our viewers that President Ivan Duque recently made the decision to resume aerial spraying, for example, of the coca fields. But this, of course, is a problem that has been extremely difficult, Mr. President. What can you tell our viewers about the nature of the narcotics problem and just more broadly, the obstacles that you see for full implementation of the peace agreement?
Well, let me say, to begin answering your question, that making peace is more difficult than making war, and it's a typical type of leadership. I made war as Minister of Defense, and that's why I was elected president, because I was a war hero. I was a hawk, and then I became a dove. That was very costly politically, and making peace.
And the president under whom you served, President Uribe, went from being a dear friend to less
Right.
than a dear friend, I might say.
Because he thought I was a traitor because I brought the guerrillas to the negotiating table. He wanted to disappear the guerrilla forces, which was impossible in a geography, and you know that, General, better than I do. The Colombian geography is ideal for guerrilla warfare, and it's better to end the process. There's never a perfect peace, never, but a bad peace is always better than a good war. And so we signed the peace agreement. One of the elements of the peace agreement was the eradication of the coca plantations, which we had tried for almost 30 years, spraying. And I must tell you, and everybody that is hearing us, in Plan Colombia, I was either Minister of Defense or President for almost 70% of the time. And so I was responsible for spraying more hectares than any other person in the history of the world, because Colombia is one of the few countries, the only country, that sprayed against the coca plants, against illegal plants. And I extradited more Colombians to the US than anybody, more than 1,400 extraditions I signed as president. I seized more tons of coca than any other person or president before me, because we had a very effective cooperation with the US Navy and with the Army intelligence and with the Southern Command, and that was extremely effective. We seized tons and tons of coke. However, the business continued, and I say that it's like a static bicycle that you pedal, you pedal, you pedal. You do all kinds of efforts, and you look to the left, you look to the right, and you're in the same place. Why is that? And I have learned the hard way that the approach that the world, when the world declared war on drugs back in the 1970s, President Nixon was president at that time, the approach has been the wrong approach. You need to be much more practical. You cannot treat a consumer of drugs as a criminal. He's somebody who's sick. He's addicted. You cannot treat a peasant who grows marijuana as a criminal and take him to jail. If you have many states in the US where right now producing, selling, and consuming marijuana is legal, how can you explain to that peasant that he's going to jail, but in the US that is legal? So we need to change the approach. And the same way that the US got rid of the mafias during Prohibition, and I love to refer to an anecdote in the last marvelous biography of Winston Churchill by a writer called Andrew Roberts.
You know, he's a fellow here at Hoover as well. Andrew Roberts is.
Oh, so he has this anecdote. Churchill arrived in California in the 20s through Canada, and he asked for a drink. And they said, no, Mr. Churchill, this is prohibited here. And he said, how strange this country is, referring to the US, this huge amount of profits that are made in the sale of liquor, you give them to the mafias. In my country, we give them to the treasury. That, in a way, summarizes the approach that I think we, in a very bold and frank position, should now adopt in the war on drugs. We must say a war that has been going on for 50 years and that has not been won is a war that has been lost, and we must recognize it. And then if we lost the war, what do we do about it? How can we cope with that? And that is a type of cooperation, US, Colombia, and the rest of the world, because this is a problem for the whole world, not for US and Colombia only.
Well, thanks, Mr. President. It does require fresh thinking, obviously, because these, as you recognize, these networks profit from the trafficking. They become stronger. They become sources of state weakness. I mean, these problems are related. We see what's happening in some of the Central American states and in Mexico as well. I'd like to talk to you maybe about some of these broader dynamics across the hemisphere. One of them is social unrest, right? It's been a heck of a year for all of us, right? With a pandemic and a recession and so forth. And I think you've seen the tension between those who are in support of a free market economic approach in Argentina, those who would like more of a statist approach to their economies. In Chile, there have been demonstrations as well, and in Colombia in 2019, even before the pandemic hit, protests about economic inequality. And so as Colombia, all of us hopefully are beginning to emerge from this pandemic, are you concerned about more social unrest? And how do you see the situation within Colombia as you emerge from a pandemic and the country's headed toward a presidential election in 2022?
The answer is yes, I am concerned. I am concerned because this pandemic has showed us much more clearly the many things that were wrong, not only in Colombia, in the whole region. We are the most in unequal region in the whole world, the most unequal continent in the whole world. The concentration of wealth in Latin America is higher than anywhere else in the world. This showed us the weakness of our health systems, the pandemic. And it has aggravated poverty. We, in the whole region and in Colombia, had been rather successful in bringing down poverty in the last 15, 20 years. But the pandemic has brought us back to at least 20 years before. And this is going to aggravate the social unrest, which was in a trend of getting stronger and stronger, the unrest, because of the inequality, because of what many people call the revolution of rising expectations. With so many people getting out of poverty, they now say, now I can progress. So they demand more and better education, more and better health systems, more and better infrastructure. And many times the states, they don't have the capacity to fulfill those demands. So the pressure, the social pressure increases. And what we saw in Chile, Chile was the star of Latin America in every indicator, growth, fight against poverty, equality. They were the best. Why was Chile so unrestful before the pandemic? Well, precisely because people were very frustrated because they wanted a lot more. So we have an opportunity now and a great challenge. And I think working with the US, we could also do it because the US is in a way also in the same situation. We need to reconsider a lot of our, what they call the social contract. What is it that the state should do? What are the priorities? It's not only growth, it's not only what the IMF or the World Bank says. There are other priorities that people need and they have to be addressed. One of them that is becoming more and more important is the environment. And we need to introduce into our development plans those new ingredients that people are demanding. One of them being taking care of our environment, of our biodiversity. Latin America, Colombia is one of the richest countries in terms of biodiversity in the world, and if we continue to destroy our forests, well, all the world is going to be in worse shape. So there are tremendous challenges. I think I always try to see the challenges as opportunities, and we have a great opportunity to sort of re-engineer our social contract and prioritize things that we did not prioritize before. Chile, again, using the example of the best performing country. Well, they bragged about, look at our growth rates, look at these indicators of GNP, but then there are many things that are not included in those indicators that are very important to the people. So that's what we have to sort of reestablish and negotiate among the people. A social contract is a negotiation among the people. What are our priorities? Who should we really help as a country and as a state? To what extent the state should intervene or not? These are questions that after the pandemic, every country is going to have. And I hopefully, with good leadership, this will not be a matter of social unrest, but a matter of political discussions that unite the countries. I am very, very concerned about what is happening in Latin America, which is also happening in the US, of this polarization. People not wanting to hear other people that think differently from what you think. We need to do away with that, finding common ground, building bridges. in the US and in Latin America, and between the US and Latin America. And I think the post-pandemic is a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the areas of opportunity are adjustments to supply chains that have been biased very much in favor of efficiency and cost effectiveness rather than resiliency. And of course, the over reliance on China for many of the critical critical commodities, products that we needed to combat the pandemic was an area of vulnerability. So I agree with you. There are tremendous opportunities in the hemisphere. There are examples of countries that are struggling. I think some of the countries are those that have taken the statist approach to an economic model. This is Argentina, which is facing a debt crisis. The most extreme example, though, is your neighbor, a failed state of Venezuela, right? And I think the cause there is pretty clear. It's the nature of that authoritarian dictatorship, which has abrogated the Constitution, denied the people a say in how they're governed, and created all the mechanisms of a police state, with the help of Cuba and in league with others like Nicaragua. I'd just like to, I know we worked on this, and I really appreciated your leadership within the OAS, the work that we did really with the group of countries that were most affected, you and Brazil in particular, but also Peru and Chile and Mexico and Argentina played a very strong role in calling for the restoration of constitutional government in Venezuela, isolating Maduro, strengthening the opposition, and then trying to come up with some form of a negotiated settlement to get Maduro out of there and restore Venezuela's representative form of government. How do you see the situation now? It's just that, I mean, every time I think it can't get worse, Venezuela, they've hit bottom. It does get worse. And how do you see it developing in the future, Mr. President?
Well, General, you must remember the meeting we had with President Trump and all his cabinet in New York in September of 2017, and many of the Latin American presidents.
Yeah.
And I told President Trump, and I told you and the whole cabinet there was Vice President Pence was there, the Secretary of State was there, the Chief of Staff, General Kelly was there. And I said, Venezuela is an airplane that ran out of gas. It can either crash or can have a soft landing. And President Trump asked me, what do you mean by a soft landing? I said, a peaceful and negotiated solution. Maduro must go, but he must go in a way that will be an effective solution to the Venezuelans. And I said at that time, you must bring the major stakeholders to allow that soft landing. And President Trump, you remember, asked me, who are they? And I said, China, Russia, Cuba, of course, the US, and Latin America. They are the major stakeholders that can bring about this change. And after all that has happened since then, the very hardline approach with the sanctions and the diplomatic isolation, the cruel reality is that today Maduro is stronger than he was 2 years ago. Venezuela is much worse, but Maduro, his regime, is stronger. So I think, and this is, many other people are now thinking that the solution is a soft landing. We must bring the stakeholders, and we must build, like in any conflict resolution, a bridge for the regime to go out. This is the only way to have a peaceful transition. I think this is possible, and I hope that the conditions can be created. A solution of this sort needs the necessary conditions to be present, and I think these conditions are now becoming a reality. And I am also optimistic that a solution of that sort can be achieved.
No, I think we have to do something different. I think also, Mr. President, the isolation of the regime from sources of external support that support his police state, right? And of course, this is mainly Cuban expertise and Cuban personnel, right? Cuba is trying to hang on to the one model that mirrors theirs.
Something general that more and more becomes a fact. The policy of the sanctions don't hurt the regimes; they hurt the people.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of examples now. Well, Cuba is one of the examples. Iran is another example, and Venezuela. So we also have to be audacious and creative in the solution. And I truly believe that a negotiated solution is possible, because Maduro knows that his days are not eternal, that his days have an ending, and that he wouldn't want to end the way that he will end if things simply continue to deteriorate, and that could take a long time. Remember Zimbabwe.
Absolutely.
I remember hearing, Zimbabwe is going to collapse next year or the next 5 years.
Or North Korea. North Korea is another example, right?
It took 40 years. So, yeah. And Venezuela cannot take 40 years to get rid of this regime.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see what's happening with the Venezuelan people, and it's such a rich country and so much potential. It's, it shows you what so it's a great example of what socialism does. An authoritarian regime that's takes on the statist economic model. Hey, I do want to talk just a little bit more about emerging from the crises that we've been in, and you already mentioned the strain that the pandemic's put on Colombia from a social and economic perspective, and there are these interconnected problems, right? Of healthcare and energy security and food security and water security. What else do you think are really critical elements of improving healthcare in the wake of COVID-19? What have you learned from the pandemic in Colombia, and what are the other steps to help Colombia, and then by connection, the region emerge from these traumas?
Well, I think that this pandemic has allowed us to realize that we all live in one house, which is the planet. It's called planet Earth. And we are one race, which is the human race. And if we don't take care of our house, we will all perish. So climate change and the environment is becoming the most important challenge for the world. But the good news is that this pandemic is the first time that the whole of the human race starts to work together to solve one single problem. And look at the results. Remember a year ago that they said, the vaccine will take years. Well, it took months. And it took months because science was elevated to where it should always be. And we do that in our challenge to preserve our planet and to fight climate change. We will always also be successful. In terms of health, many people don't realize that the origin of the pandemic is the spillover between wildlife and human health. Animal health and human health, that's the origin of the pandemic. And what happened to the health of the animals and wildlife? The deterioration of the environment and of biodiversity is what has caused this spillover. So the interconnection between health, the environment, the ecosystem is very clear. How do we address that? By using the same sentence that was used and is still being used and should be used in the future to address the pandemic. We will not be safe until everybody is safe. And that forces us to have cooperation among nations. And that forces us to strengthen again what was weakened, called multilateralism. Because we live in one house, which is the planet, and we need to cooperate. And so I think if we realize that, and we're seeing good signs and good, for example, last week the G7 took last Friday a very important step in helping the poor countries with their vaccines. This is the type of cooperation that is needed to address the core problems, the basic problems that this pandemic is sort of showing that not that it cost them. The pandemic aggravated the problems, and so we must address them all together.
Well, I agree with you that if you have an international problem, you need an international solution. Sadly, some countries don't seem like they're just waiting around to cooperate with us, Mr. President. And I would say China in particular. So I'd like to ask you a question about China and in the hemisphere in particular. You know that some people have said, okay, the pandemic's created a fire sale, right? And China's just going to be snapping up bargain investments. As you know, Colombia's accepted a significant amount of Chinese investment. This is the metro contract in Bogota, for example, and other many other investments as well. But do you see a danger in Chinese investment in terms of the strings attached? And how do you see China's involvement in the hemisphere broadly?
Well, I can refer to my personal experience with a Chinese investment. I never accepted the strings attached. And so the Chinese investment in Colombia was very small compared to other countries in Latin America. Other countries did accept the strings attached. Of course, the Chinese are interested in penetrating different areas of the world. They've been very aggressive in Africa and in some countries of Latin America. Not that the Chinese investment is not welcomed. What is not welcomed is what you mentioned, the strings attached. What is behind that?
Like what happened in Ecuador, for example. Right, exactly.
So I hope that the different leaders in Latin America realize, yes, the Chinese are welcome, but under certain conditions. Not the way they want, but the way it is useful for us, Latin American countries. And the normal sort of area for cooperating of the US is Latin America. And I think this bipolarity that is emerging from the post-pandemic will bring us closer, should bring us closer, US and Latin America. This is something that has been there on the table for 200 years, but maybe this time we can really put it to work. And we have tremendous elements to complement each other and to create synergies between what the US wants and needs and what Latin America wants and needs.
Yeah, I agree. I do think there's an opportunity. I have one last question for you. Of course, you know, this is coming up on an election year next year in Colombia. A lot of big issues associated with the economy and the recovery. And I know that President Duque has announced proposed tax reform in the next legislative session. And there's this tension with the need for fiscal reform, but also the need for stimulus to grow out of this crisis. And there's of course a danger associated with that, as it was with the investment grade rating, and but also on the other hand, the need to address unemployment and so forth. And what do you think the big issues are going into the election, and in particular, how do you think this debate is going to come out in connection with Colombia's plan for economic recovery?
I have been very careful of not making comments about my successor, President Duque, because I think the former presidents should help when they are asked to help, but should not interfere in their work. But saying that, President Duque has big problems. He's weak politically. I don't think that the reforms that are needed, one of them is the fiscal reform, will pass in Congress. He only has 14, 15 months left in his government. And what I hope is that he uses this time to unite the country. We have been asking him, unite the country. You need the country united to take bold and important decisions like we were united before in taking important decisions. I hope that he understands that his political capital is not enough to pass the reforms, the very important reforms, fiscal. We need a pension reform badly, and other type of reforms. But then if we unite, for example, around the implementation of the peace process, which is a constitutional obligation. It's not that either he wants or doesn't want. It's right now in our constitution. If he does that, then he will sort of plant the seed for the next government to approve the reforms and for Colombia to keep the upgoing trend that we had before the pandemic.
Mr. President, thank you so much. Thanks for your friendship, your wisdom over the years, and for joining me on Battlegrounds. Any last words you'd like to say to our viewers?
No, the only thing I have is gratitude with you, General, and with the U.S. governments, all of them, and with the U.S. people, because we have been partners in the worst situations and partners also in the happy situations. And I hope that in the challenges that the world has, and we have many challenges after this pandemic, that special relationship that we have had with the US can be maintained, can be strengthened, because in that way, we will all be better off.
Hey, President Santos, on behalf of the Hoover Institution, thank you for helping us learn more about battlegrounds important to building a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. It was great to see you.
Thank you, General, and thank you for having me in this very important event.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.